Thuringwethil I am, who cast a shadow o'er the face aghast of the sallow moon in the doomed land of shivering Beleriand. Luthien in her disguise from the Lay of Luthien, Canto 13. Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe. Today I'm loosely going to get into vampires in Tolkien's Legendarium. That is to say, namely the character of Thuringwethil, Sauron's Herald from the Tale of Beren and Luthien. Vampires were a subject that Tolkien was no stranger to, as just around the time he was born, the novel of Dracula, one of the greatest novels ever written in my opinion, came out. Tolkien obviously read it, was obviously rather taken with the story of Dracula and with vampires as mythological creatures, though I suspect he wanted to avoid the kind of romanticism that was already starting in his lifetime surrounding vampires, as he probably took notice of the fact that a lot of people were getting really into that side of the vampires, thinking them sexy, so that he took a different route. So without further ado, Tolkien's choice for using the word vampire is something that seems to have confused some people. There are those who think he chose it just because he needed a bat-associated monster, just as he used werewolves to denote wolf-like creatures in his stories. I, however, think that he chose vampires for a very, very good reason, but that he was concerned with the psychological reading of the text that people had begun to use with Dracula, where people would sympathize with Vlad in the novel rather than Jonathan and Mina. That said, there's a lot of similarities between Jonathan and Mina and Beren and Luthien's tale. A lot of them. But that's a separate video for another time. That said, Tolkien describes his vampires more as bat-like creatures, yet there is a certain amount of transformational abilities on the part of the vampires. So this part is fairly accurate to classic vampiric literature from the Victorian era. Quite why he decided to include vampires in the first place could be just him wanting creatures of the night, to hint at how there's more to the servants of Morgoth than at first thought. Because the thing about vampires is that they come from primarily Eastern European mythology. Though, obviously, by the 19th century, they had made their way to Ireland, given that Bram Stoker grew up with stories of vampires being told to him as a child. It is very likely that some of these stories made their way to England. And being an expert on linguistics and mythology, Tolkien obviously knew a lot about the stories from the East. So that his choice in selecting this sort of creature as being part of his narrative, his favorite at that, is very, very curious and very, very interesting. The main one, who's a named antagonist, is Thuringwethil. Sauron himself also takes the shape of a vampire on at least one occasion when he clashes with Beren and Luthien and kind of loses the fight. Thuringwethil was Sauron's herald and was stationed at Tol Ingorhoth by the time of the quest for the Silmaril. She would end up slain, but she was obviously a figure of terror for probably the local people, and it is implied she may have been once a Maiar, a lesser one, in the service of Sauron, and she is described as having fingered wings and iron claws, so that obviously she was not someone who could be taken lightly in battle. Luthien, though, takes on Thuringwethil's mantle, so to speak, and disguises herself as her, that is to say, as a large bat. This brings to mind the mythological image of Loki wearing the eagle cloak of Freya in order to fly and pretend to be an eagle, like how Freya could often do, with Freya herself being queen of the gods and wife to Odin and goddess of love, battle. She was the head Valkyrie, also the most powerful and most iconic goddess in Norse mythology, and was said to be the most beautiful. Luthien has the honor of holding the title of in Tolkien's Legendarium, so that we get both a nod here to Eastern mythology, but also Scandinavian mythology. If we examine the meaning of her name in Sindarin, you'll find that it means woman of the secret shadow. So one could easily read this as her being the secret shadow. Prefer to think of that as a nod to Sauron. Now, we don't know enough about the relationship between Sauron and Thuringwethil in order to say that she was his woman, but we can certainly say that she was the woman in service of the Secret Shadow. Sauron is often called the Shadow in the Second Age. Morgoth was the Dark Lord, but Sauron is the Shadow. In a way, you could say that Sauron is the Shadow to Morgoth, always following after him and serving him. In turn, though, Sauron assuming the role of a vampire brings with it ideas of Dracula from the novel, not the various movie depictions. And in the novel, Dracula is a cruel figure with little to no mercy and goodness, whom does things such as throwing a baby before his bride so that they may devour it, and otherwise running with wolves and spreading terror throughout the local villages, while also tormenting Jonathan Harker. And of course, he slays Lucy, the fair maiden who attracted the love of Quincy, Arthur, and Seward, and whom was childhood friend to Mina, the love of Jonathan's life. So Dracula is a vengeful figure who wishes to punish Harker and his friends throughout the novel, such as when he goes after Mina at one point. Not because he's attracted to Mina, but because he just wants to inflict pain upon them, knowing that Mina is special to them. In turn, he's cruel to the local villagers, whom he ought to be kind to as their lord. The thing about Sauron's fort during the time of the story is that it's destroyed by Luthien in an act of magic, I guess you could say. In the Dracula novel, it's Jonathan and Mina who really take down Dracula. In the Silmarillion, it's Beren and Luthien. In turn, though, Sauron he's cruel to those he ought to be kind to, that is to say, those who are quote-unquote beneath him. I'm just saying that there is a bit of a connection there that I find is hard to ignore. And if you consider the possibility of Thuringwethil and Sauron having a very particular kind of relationship, you could say that she's rather like the one bride who is the head of the various brides of Dracula in the novel, the one the other two deferred to. So you've got a lot of connotations with the vampiric figures of Tolkien's Silmarillion and Beren and Luthien tales, but it's the only point in the Legendarium when we see Thuringwethil and vampires. So tell me what you thought of this video, and if you appreciated this video and my humble attempts to explore the subject of vampires in the Legendarium, feel free to sing to that like and subscribe button as though you were Luthien singing